James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Newton Minow might very well have been successful in his profession, and yet little remembered by the public, were it not for two words spoken by him in his maiden speech as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission in 1961. He described television as a vast wasteland, thus managing at the same time to arouse the fury of broadcasters while adding a new phrase to their lexicon. Newton Minow served only 27 months of a 7-year term on the FCC. And yet in those 27 months, he mobilized the forces of rhetoric as none before him had done to do battle with the complacency of broadcasters and the apathy of the public. He returned to private law practice in Chicago after his government service, wrote a book, Equal Time, the Private Broadcaster and the Public Interest, and pursued his continuing interest in such fields as communications and education. I was finally ordered to drop the... Newt, some 13 years ago, you described TV in these words: a procession of game shows, violence, audience participation shows, formula comedies about totally unbelievable families, blood and thunder, mayhem, violence, sadism, murder, Western bad men, Western good men, private eyes, gangsters, more violence, and so forth. You recall that, I hope.
Yes, I do, Jim, very well.
Have you seen a vast difference since?
Well, I still think the medium is still, unfortunately, not up to the audience. I think we still tend, people in broadcasting, commercial broadcasting and non-commercial broadcasting, to underestimate the intelligence of the viewer. I think things are better in certain directions. I think there's a lot more news and information on television as opposed to the early 60s. I certainly think public television has enormously improved since the early 60s. But I'm afraid I'd have to not retract what I said about
why does television tend to underrate the intelligence of the audience? They do take surveys. They know who's watching what.
I think there's an irony in it. I think television itself largely is responsible for elevating the education and information in the viewer. People learn from television. And then television doesn't realize that the audience has moved, and they stay where they were. I think that's a big part of the problem.
I've often wondered if it isn't partially a matter of conditioning the audience to expect a certain kind of thing from the television set. That is to say, to expect something that will not be terribly demanding of their attention, and therefore they don't get anything which is terribly demanding of their attention for the most part.
Well, that's right. Of course, people who run, I think, most of the entertainment programming may be right. They think that people who want to watch television in the evening are tired, they've had a busy day at work or at home with the children or whatever, and they want to relax. And for the most part, I think that's true.
How do you relax when you're tired? Do you look at vacuous television?
Sometimes I've got the television on, usually with a book or a newspaper, and there are certain programs I'll watch regularly, which I enjoy.
But if you're reading a book and looking at television, you're not relaxing in the sense in which you just described it.
No, but I've sort of got one eye or one ear cocked to hear what's going on. But I am a television fan. I think one of the reasons that I went into the FCC and have been involved is that I care about television. When I went into the government in the early 60s, President Kennedy had asked me to be the chairman of the Federal Power Commission or of the Federal Trade Commission. I wouldn't have been interested. But the Federal Communications Commission, because it dealt with television, is why I
What
was
what
interested.
was the source of your interest in television? You certainly, young as you are, didn't grow up on television. You're not that young.
I was fascinated with it from the time it began, right from the start. I regarded it, and still do, as the most important invention, really, I think, in centuries. I think it's the most important thing since the printing press. And I saw, and still see, its monumental significance to the people. I was very interested in it in political television. I was in the presidential campaigns of 1952 and 1956 with Governor Stevenson, and he never watched television.
He didn't?
No. Was
he
wasn't-
the traditional egghead that...
He was
eschewed
busy, and
television?
of course I think at that time, unless you were young, it was pretty hard to change and become terribly interested. And I remember being with him, for example, in 1952 in Springfield, the night that Mr. Nixon, then running for vice president in '52, made the famous Checkers speech. And we were in Springfield, Illinois, and we couldn't even see the picture because we had such a poor television set in the executive mansion in Springfield. And I thought, my goodness, here we are, the most important thing of the campaign. We don't even know what's going on. But I was very tuned to television.
What was Mr. Stevenson's reaction?
Well, he
Not
couldn't
to
see
the
it.
television, but to Mr. Nixon.
He was outraged by what he heard. We couldn't see it, but he thought it was really a very low attempt, disregarding the intelligence of people, but it was terribly effective nonetheless.
You grew up in Milwaukee, didn't
Yes.
you, Newt? I suppose with radio. Were you a radio fan when you were a youngster?
Very much so. And when I was in high school, which was during World War II, in fact, I left high school to go into the Army in World War II. I remember going to the dedication of the first big new television studio in Chicago, in Milwaukee, to appear on the air in a capacity in the war high school effort. And as I say, it was WTMJ. And since then, I have, my interest in television has not diminished.
But you
in the
chose
least.
to go into law, obviously. You went to Northwestern
Yes,
Law School.
I went to law school at Northwestern. I was very fortunate. Northwestern recommended me to become law clerk to the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice Vinson. And I had an extraordinary education in that position.
What did you learn other than the law itself as the law clerk to Chief Justice Vinson?
Well, I learned that the things we exalt, the great institutions we exalt, the Supreme Court above all, are still run by human beings, even as you or me. I'll tell you a marvelous anecdote that I never forgot. At that time, the Chief Justice of the United States did not have a car or a driver. And one of the jobs of the law clerk to the Chief Justice was to take the Chief Justice home at the end of the day. And one evening we were driving home, and I could see the Chief Justice was very glum and very blue. I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well," he said, "a man came in to see me today and asked me if I'd like to be the commissioner of baseball at a great deal of money." So I said, "Well, you can't go from being Chief Justice of the United States to be commissioner of baseball." He said, "I know it, and it's killing me." He was a great baseball fan, and he would have loved it. But I always remembered that as an insight into, you'd think that anybody who was Chief Justice of the United States would think that's the greatest job in the world.
I suppose it may have influenced your judgment about going into government service, which probably paid less than you might have made in private life at that point
A
as well.
great deal less, but I think that everybody who has a chance at some significant public service ought to do it. I really do. I think, in fact, I'm a great believer that all young people should have to devote a year of their life to public service.
You left, when you left the position as law clerk, you became a junior law partner, did you not, with Adlai Stevenson?
Well, I started with him as governor. He had hired me to work as one of his assistants as governor, and the day I arrived was the beginning of the Democratic Convention in '52, where he was nominated for president.
I say.
So after the convention, he called me in and he said, "Newt," he said, "you agreed to come here and work for me as governor. If you don't want to continue, you don't have to." So I said, "Oh no, this is much more exciting than it was before." So I was with him through the campaign and the end of his service as governor, and then I went back to the law practice, and then later he asked me to join him, and we organized a law firm.
Was he any particular influence upon your own approach toward life or toward government service?
Very much so. In fact, I don't think there's anyone who's influenced me more.
In what directions?
Well, Governor Stevenson gave me a sense of commitment, I think, that politics is, in fact, a noble cause, that it is the most important profession that a person can engage in, and that all of us must somehow engage in politics. And Governor Stevenson also made me a Democrat, which I really wasn't before. And he...
was it just the admiration for the man in this particular case, as well as what he stood for, I suppose?
It was a combination of things, but I think that he's had an enormous effect on me, and everything that that has happened to me really has been largely because of Governor Stevenson.
What kind of president do you think he might have made, or is that too much in the realm of speculation?
Well, it's hard to speculate, but at the same time, I have some feelings about it. I think he would have been one of our best presidents, largely in the foreign affairs field. I doubt very much that we would have gone the very heavy Cold War direction. We would never have gotten ourselves into the commitments in Vietnam. We never would have had the icy relations with China that persisted until the early 70s. I think that he was a very astute and perceptive observer of foreign affairs, and would have led us in a different way.
Oftentimes, intellectuals have a difficult time getting others to go along with them, and most especially, I suppose, groups of politicians like the Congress. Not that they're anti-intellectual, but an intellectual does have a more difficult time, does he not?
He does, yet at the same time, I remember being always subject to the criticism when he was running that he was speaking over the heads of the people. He wasn't really communicating with them. And while there is some truth in it, there's also some falsity in it. I think we want a president who we respect intellectually. We want a president who we think is a wise, well-educated, experienced person. And we don't want a person who is just appealing to our baser instincts.
It was through your campaigning for Governor Stevenson that you met the Kennedys, I assume.
Yes, it was. In fact, I was one of those who kept hounding Governor Stevenson to take Jack Kennedy as his running mate for vice president in 1956. I felt that he was a perfect complement to the Stevenson candidacy. I never succeeded in that, but I did meet the Kennedys through that.
Why did you fail?
Well, Governor Stevenson felt that, you remember in '56, he left the decision to the convention. Kefauver had had enormous support in the primaries, and he also wanted to demonstrate that the vice presidency was sufficiently important so that he shouldn't be chosen just by one man, that the party itself ought to participate. So he left it open, and as, of course, it was a great break for Jack Kennedy. He came close and didn't win, but everybody got to know him.
You got to know Bobby Kennedy through this association, and the story goes that it was your interest and Bobby's interest in children and television's effect upon children that finally led you to the FCC. You said you had a long time interest in television.
Well, that's correct. When President Kennedy was elected, Sarge Shriver was sort of the headhunter, and he called me the next day and he said, the President would like you to come to Washington to be part of his administration. And I said, I would like to, but I said, first, I can't afford it. I've got small children, and we have to give up the law practice. And so on. He said, well, we really would like to have you. And I said, well, if it was something really sensational and important, but I would, but otherwise no. And Bob Kennedy heard about this, and he suggested that I would, he knew of my deep interest in television and in children. I had been involved in educational television, then called educational television, educational films. And it was through Bob that I was recommended to the President.
For the
post as chairman of the FCC. In fact, when I went to Washington, I remember very, very well one evening we were at Bob's house for dinner. And he said something to me I never forgot. He said, when he was a child, he was always told that there were three great influences on a child: the home, the school, and the church. But he said he had become convinced that there was now a fourth great influence based on what he'd observed in his home, and that was television. He said his kids were spending more time with television than they were with anything else. I said, well, that's true universally. And that's really what, one of the things that motivated me to say what I did and to do what I did when I was in the government.
You spent a little over 2 years in a post to which you were appointed for 7.
Right. I told the president when I went there that it was hard for me to go, it was a bad time, but I would be there for 2 years. In fact, I called up the president 2 years to the day that I arrived and said I wanted to see him. He had me over and he said, Newt, you're the only guy that's been here who's never asked to see me. He said, whenever I've seen you, it's been when I wanted to see you. He said, I know why you're here. You want to see me because you want to go home. I said, that's right, Mr. President. I told you I'd be here 2 years, and 2 years are up. He said, you sure you don't want to change your mind? I said, I'd love to, but I just can't. I want to return. And he said, well, will you stay till I get someone else? And I said, yes. Well, that was another 6 months. But that was our arrangement, and that's what I did.
When, soon after you left, you wrote to the president,
Yes.
suggesting that the FCC be reorganized, as a matter of fact, be abolished. Is that right?
Well, not abolished, but definitely reorganized. I think the FCC should be reorganized. I think the FCC, as presently organized, is incapable of doing the mission and meeting its responsibility. I think the FCC, first of all, has too much to do. I don't think a 7-person body is the way to run it, combining as it does the role of judge, jury, and lawmaker. I think you should have a smaller commission, and if you're in an argument with the commissioner, off you go to a court to decide if he's right or wrong, not to have it all in one place. And this was my view and is still my view now.
Since you left the FCC, you have, I believe, represented some of the organizations that you did regulate as an FCC commissioner. Do you still feel as strongly as you did about the role of the government in regulation?
Yes, I haven't changed my view. I think the government must be in the regulatory area of communications. I think the danger is, and I felt this when I was in the government, and I feel it now. I've been on both sides of the bar. Broadcasting is the only medium of expression under government regulation. Under the First Amendment, there are very serious constraints on what the government ought to be doing. And the intersection of the First Amendment and the rights of broadcasters on the one hand and the government's responsibility on the other is a battle which I doubt will ever be solved. In fact, I think the best and healthiest thing we can find is that there's a constant clash between them. And I think the government has to follow a very, very, very cautious role. You take the medium we're on right now, public television, which in many ways has government funding behind it. At the same time, we cannot have the government telling us what we put on the air.
When you listed those accomplishments that you felt had been achieved in your 27 months as chairman of the FCC, you put the growth of public television as one of these, as a matter of fact. That is the encouragement of the growth. And of course, I recall vividly you played a very important role in getting a VHF channel, Channel 13 for New York City, for example, when you were commissioner.
Yes, you know how that happened. I read one day in the paper, I didn't get it from the staff or anything, I read one day in the paper that Channel 13, which was a commercial station in New York, actually licensed in New Jersey, was being sold. And I called our staff and I said, that's not going to be sold to any commercial interest. That's going to go, we're going to make that into an educational television station. And they said, Mr. Chairman, there's no way to do that under the law. I said, don't tell me that. You see, this is one of the virtues of not being a civil servant. You know you're not going to have your career there, and you're willing to do things a little differently. I said, don't give me those no's. We're going to do it. You just tell me how we're going to do it. And we had a terrific battle and enormous effort. And finally, it ended up that we were successful. And Edward R. Murrow, I'll never forget this, and I were invited to launch the station in his first broadcast. And there was a union strike opening night. And Ed Murrow had never crossed a picket line in his life. And we both went together across the picket line because we thought it was more important to get the station on the air. And that's what it began. But I felt if we didn't have a public television station in New York, there was no chance to build a network.
Yet there is an irony in the fact that the public bought back its own channel for, what was it, $6.5 million, something
Yeah,
like
the
that.
foundations put up the money, and of course what we should have never permitted in the first place was that we didn't assign a public television station to New York or to Los Angeles in the VHF band. It was a terrible mistake. You know, when I went to the government, coming from Chicago, President Kennedy came to the government from Boston. In our ignorance, we thought every big city had a public television station. He was very familiar with the one in Boston. I was familiar with the one in Chicago. And it was a shock to me to find out that there was no public television station in New York or in Washington or in Philadelphia or in Baltimore or in Los Angeles. It was a revelation. And that's why we set to work to try to change things.
Another thing about what you felt very strongly, I know, Newt, has been the matter of the use of television by and for politicians, political television.
I think it's a disgrace that, in fact, I'd say it's an outrage that candidates purchase television and radio time in the United States. I think the broadcasting is a public resource, and I think there should be a certain amount of time made available to candidates without cost to them, and that they should not be allowed to buy time. Because
it's enormously expensive for candidates.
It's
to begin
terribly
with.
expensive, and as we've seen from the Watergate disclosures, the intersection of money and politics is the root of most of our problems, and most of that money goes to purchase television time. And what we should do, I headed a bipartisan commission on this, and some of our reforms were adopted by the Congress. What we should do, I believe, is have the government provide the time to the candidates at the government's expense. We figured out that giving each presidential candidate 6 half hours on every radio and television station in the country simultaneously, in other words, that's the way the president goes on the air. When he goes on, he preempts all the channels. We would give them 6 half hours on all the television stations, radio stations in prime time. Would cost less than mailing a postcard to every voter. Less than a postcard to every voter.
And television would be reimbursed for its time at government expense.
At half rates.
At half rates.
We figured our thought was that the broadcasters should not make money on it, but neither should they lose. They would simply be reimbursed for their costs. And on that basis, we felt that one of the most fundamental reforms in American politics could occur. You know, the United States is one of the few, and some people think the only, but it isn't the only. There are a couple of Latin American countries where politicians purchase time on radio and television.
Is that right?
That's all. I mean, you go to England, you go to Canada, you go to Germany, you go to France, you go anywhere you want. And the system I'm talking about is followed in Japan, and we cannot continue this system. It's wrong. It's immoral.
Your most recent book dealt with another political problem. This problem of the problem of the president's access to television is against the access of the other branches of government, most particularly Congress.
Yes, I think really television, without anybody knowing it, has amended the Constitution. We believe under the Constitution that there are 3 branches of government that are equal, but only one, the executive, has
They were more equal before television.
Right. Well, only one has access to television on his own terms. The president can go on television, as he should, to speak to the nation without cost, prime time, anytime he wants, on all the stations. I think that's marvelous. That's the great triumph of the broadcast medium. But at the same time, we have to have a way for the Congress, and also, I think, for the opposition party to give its views to the electorate so that the electorate can make up its own mind.
So the opposition party, unlike the opposition party in Great Britain, doesn't have that easily identifiable leader, which does make it more complicated in this country.
I think if they were offered television time, one of the great things would happen would be that the opposition would have to pick a leader to speak. And one of the things that's gone wrong in our country, I think, is that the opposition does not have a spokesman or a leader. I am one of those who believe that the two-party system is basically needed in this country to have a democratic process working effectively. It's become very fashionable and intellectually respectable for people to say, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm an independent, and I vote for the man. I think that's a very fallacious point of view.
Why?
Because by doing that, they forfeit the chance to pick the candidates. And then they come to the election day, let's say in 1972, and have confronted with a choice between Nixon and McGovern, and they say, well, we don't like the choices that we have. Well, whose fault was that? It was their fault for not getting involved in their party to pick a candidate that they would rather have had. So I think one of the things about giving the opposition television time would be to identify sharply what the opposition position is on an issue, and I think we've got to get people more involved in party politics in order to keep the system working.
So they don't like their candidate, they can fight within the party to get the candidate they do like.
They have nobody to complain to if they end up with, they have no right to complain if they haven't participated in the selection of candidates. And under the system, the party is where the candidates are selected. Now, I've been at the last 6 Democratic conventions as a delegate with Governor Stevenson, and I really believe what we have to do somehow, we went wrong somewhere in young people not seeing that that the party is an instrument of social change. The party is the vehicle. I don't care if it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but it's the party that is the instrument by which change is effected. And if our best people would get involved in the party of their choice, then the system would function.
Newt, 27 months of your life were spent in the Federal Communications Commission. Most of our conversation has dealt with television. You are, I suppose, ineradically labeled as an expert in television, despite the fact that you spent only a part of your time today. Do you regret at all that every time people talk with you, people like myself, it is about television, despite the fact that that was a small moment in your life?
No, I don't, because I think it was the most important moment, and I think that it still is my interest. I teach at Northwestern University. I have law students and journalism students, and I teach something about the relationship of government and broadcasting. My law practice involves these issues. I try to write books about these issues. I think I'd be happy to be identified as that in that area.
Do you think that the advent of television has, on the whole, been good or destructive to the sort of things that you believe in for the future of this country?
Oh, I think it's been very good. I think it's been, in fact, I think it's indispensable to the future. You know, thousands and thousands of years ago, Aristotle said you couldn't have a democratic society with more than 30,000 people.
The number that could be reached by the sound of a human voice.
Human voice. Now, when you have 210 million people living in a big country, there's only one way that you can fulfill Aristotle's idea, and that's with radio and television.
Thank you very much, Newt.
Thanks, Jim.